Chapter 6 of The Miserable Life of Bernie LeBaron, The Space Helmet. If I hadn't trained myself to be quiet in the woods, I would have let out another unmanly shriek. I stumbled backwards, tripped over a root, hit my backside, and scrambled away as fast as I could. It took me several minutes before I could breathe normally again. After the initial shock wore off, I crawled over to the little crumpled form of the gray fox. Tears sprang to my eyes. A gray fox is one of the most beautiful animals in the woods. They have red fur on their heads and underbelly, while their back and sides were tinted with silver and black. The long, bushy silver tail has a black streak and ends in a black tip. I've only seen one in the wild, and I've caught a few on my cameras. They can even climb trees like a cat. The fox was still alive. It gazed up at me with eyes so filled with pain and fear that I choked on a sob. Its little chest heaved a few times. It struggled feebly to sit up before it lay still. I knelt beside it as the last breath sighed from its body. I laid a hand on its head. It was warm and soft. I could see the white ribs through the long gash that had been torn through its neck and chest. The blood had soaked all down its legs. The now lifeless eyes never stopped looking at me. "What did this to you?" I whispered. It struck me then, like never before, that these little creatures had feelings. Before it died, the fox had looked at me with as much fear and pain as any human could, just like my little sister Emily had done once when she had fallen and smacked her head. I patted the fox for a while before deciding to follow the trail back to where it was injured, to see if I could figure out what had done this. I knew that coyotes and bobcats could kill foxes, or maybe somebody had shot at it. Still, I couldn't understand how its chest got ripped open. I looked around, suddenly aware that I might not be alone in the forest. My mouth went dry. My palms began to sweat. Something, or someone, was out there that had just killed a fox. Maybe it or they were watching me right now. I know I should have just run for it, but morbid curiosity propelled me back down the trail. It took a bit of searching before I found the spot where the ground had been torn up and a few bits of fur lay scattered about. Big drops of blood splashed the leaves. No matter how hard I looked, I couldn't figure out what had killed the fox. I gave up and turned to leave when I saw a clump of grass that had been smashed to the ground. I stepped toward it to find a large boot print in the middle of an old anthill. After I swallowed the big knot that jumped into my throat, I whipped off the backpack I used to carry my cameras and pulled out my plaster of Paris. I mixed the plaster with water in a Ziploc bag and poured it over the boot print. While it dried, I took a closer look around. I could see the direction the tracks had come from, but I didn't want to start off into the woods, especially if a hunter was wandering around. Maybe he was watching me right now. The thought made goosebumps jump out all over my body. I shivered. All of the noises of the forest suddenly became louder and more threatening. Something heavy fell to the ground. A moan floated through the woods. That was it. I was out of there. I grabbed up the track, even though I knew it wasn't dry yet, and beat a path back to my bike. When I reached the bloody splash in the trail where the fox should have been, it was gone. Just gone. Disappeared. Vanished. A big bloody boot print stained the ground. That's when I really freaked out. I snagged my last cameras on my way out of the woods and pedaled like mad across the bog and back into town. The dark, staring eyes of the fox and the silent menace of the watcher in the woods chased me home. Aunt Elsie was waiting for me when I banged in through the screen door. "Where have you been?" she asked. "I called the dentist's office. They said you left 3 hours ago." I skidded to a stop and stared at her. My heart was still racing. It took my brain a minute to process what she had said, and I shrugged. "Just checking my cameras," I mumbled over the bloody wads in my mouth. I could talk now, though my tongue still felt like a piece of wood and my face felt like a spongy eraser. I tried to sound cool, but I think she saw through me because she gave me a hard look. Then she took a double take of my face and shirt. She shook her head. "You bled all over your shirt." She said this with the kind of voice that says, "How could you be so stupid?" I glanced down. The red stain had spread so much that it was now pink. I had forgotten all about it. I shrugged again. "Okay," she said, "let me see those teeth." I opened my mouth where the bloody wads were still packed in. "I think we can take these out now," she said. "Come over by the sink." When she pulled the wads out, she whistled. "They're going to be calling you the Toothless Wonder." she said. Looks like you yanked two today. Next time it'll be the other side. The dentist is a twit, I said. Aunt Elsie stepped back and looked shocked until I told her how he had yanked my teeth before the anesthetic had had a chance to work. She listened, but I could tell by the expression on her face she wasn't the least bit concerned about my suffering. Ever since I came to live with Aunt Elsie back in June, I'd noticed something about nurses. They don't have much sympathy for other people's pain. I mean, I couldn't decide if they enjoyed giving shots and torturing their patients, or if it was just that they saw so much pain that it quit bothering them. I don't know. Aunt Elsie never showed me much sympathy when I got sick or injured. She just did her nurse thing and then said, "You're on your own now." If I complained about it, she would say, "It's the body that heals, not the nurse. Give your body a chance." She was never a good one for sympathy. "Looks like cold soup for you tonight," she said. "Nice," I said. Just what I wanted. As I trudged down the hall to my room, she called after me. "Jerry will be home in a couple of days. Time to clean your cave." I wasn't worried about Jerry just then, and it isn't like he was the cleanest man in the world, not with all his little cups and cans with tobacco juice in them. I had to find out what was on my cameras and clean up the cast of the boot print. The room could wait. Most of the pictures weren't too exciting, though I did get one photo of an opossum, which I didn't have yet. Then, on the last camera, I found another picture, or three. The man was just on the edge of the camera's range again, but it had snapped 3 shots of a man with a broad-brimmed hat. He carried something like a long stick. It might have been a shovel over his shoulder. I tried to zoom in, but the picture just got even more fuzzy. I couldn't see anything else because the pictures had been snapped at night, like the first one. I checked the date. It was the same day as the first one. Could it be a coincidence? I didn't think so. I created a new folder on my hard drive that I named Murder in the Swamp, and I copied the 4 pictures I had of the man. I arranged the rest of the photos I was going to keep before I went into the bathroom to clean up the plaster of Paris cast of the track. It had a bunch of leaves and pine needles stuck to it. Once I cleaned it, I could see the tread. A crack cut across the sole near the toe. I measured the track. It was 14 inches long and at least half an inch thick. The soil hadn't been that soft, so only a big, heavy man could have made that impression. I set the track on my dresser to dry because the bloody cloth I had found the day before. Beside the bloody cloth I had found the day before. I stared at them as I reviewed what had happened over the last couple of days. The more I thought about it, the hotter my chest burned, and the more I wanted to grab this guy and stuff him into a gunny sack. Whoever this Nimrod was, he had invaded my forest, and I was going to get him. With that decided, I stripped off my bloody shirt, slipped on a new one, and went to the kitchen for dinner. "How was your first day at school?" Aunt Elsie said. I plopped into my chair. "I've got some pretty weird teachers." "You mean Mrs. Grimm?" "You could start there," I said. "I mean, she looks like a black widow, and all she did was scream at us for the whole period." Aunt Elsie nodded sagely while I bent to sip my cold soup. "She's been there a long time," she said. "She's a good teacher, if you'll listen to her." "Can't miss hearing her," I said. "She has a voice like a foghorn." "That's because she has to get it through your thick skull." Then Aunt Elsie paused and wiggled her eyebrows at me with a mischievous grin. "Any cute girls?" I shrugged but didn't say anything. Aunt Elsie smiled. "What's her name?" I shook my head in disbelief. "Tatiana," I said. "Ooh, that's a pretty name. Let me guess. She's a brunette with long hair and clear blue eyes." I sat back and gaped at her. This was the second time in 2 days that a woman had read my mind. "That's just weird," I said. "How did you know that?" She laughed. "I know her mother. She works in the lab at the hospital. She's a real nice girl, Bernie. Her father teaches at the elementary school." The mention of the hospital made me think of Marigold and Zinnia. "Have you met a woman named Zinnia?" I asked. Aunt Elsie nodded. "Yes, she was a psychologist. She retired a couple of years ago to care for her mother." "Why?" "I met them yesterday." "She's a nice woman," Aunt Elsie said. "Yeah, but have you seen her mother?" Aunt Elsie frowned and shook her head. "Okay," I said. "I'm telling you, she is the most frightening person I've ever seen. I mean, her eye drools some kind of gray, crusty stuff, and her eyelids don't work like they're supposed to. Man, is she ugly." Aunt Elsie's frown deepened, and she set her spoon down with a thump of authority. She spoke in her preachy voice. "She has Alzheimer's disease, Bernie, and she only has a little while left to live. Zinnia decided to care for her herself rather than send her off to a nursing home." "She threatened to paddle me," I said. I wanted Aunt Elsie to know, and I wasn't going to forget it. Wouldn't do any harm, Aunt Elsie said. A smile lifted at the corner of her mouth. And it might just do you some good, too. Then she paused. Oh, I almost forgot. She pushed back her chair and went into the living room. I picked this up for you today. She came back to the kitchen carrying what looked like a big white bowling ball. Then she turned it, and I could see that it was the biggest, ugliest bicycle helmet ever created. I mean, if someone had set out to create a helmet that would make any boy cry, this was it. Aunt Elsie was smiling. I just stared. I couldn't wear that thing, not if I wanted to have any self-respect. Why couldn't adults understand this? I had the same trouble with my mom. She always wanted to buy the ugliest clothes. I guess fashions were different when she was a kid. I couldn't hurt Aunt Elsie's feelings either, so I took the helmet from her hands. Thanks, I said. It's kind of big. It'll protect your frontal lobe and your occipital lobe, she said. I didn't have any idea where my occipital lobe was. From the size of the helmet, I figured it must be down near my tailbone somewhere.